Good afternoon, everyone. My name is CJ Nealing. I am the Assistant Director of Career Education at the Johns Hopkins Professional Development and Career Office, or PDCO. I am delighted to have such a engaging and diverse group here today. I can see from the chat box we have trainees from Hopkins as well as many other institutes, so welcome. I'm excited to have you here today. If you missed this earlier, we will be using the discussion box for asking questions. Sometimes I might ask a question out loud. I would love to get your feedback in there. And we will break for Q&A throughout the presentation. So the things that we'll cover today, we'll go over the basics of interviewing. We'll also go a little bit more in depth into the various types of interviews that might exist. I'll spend particular time going through virtual interviewing, since that is a major part of the interview process in our current stay-at-home orders. And I suspect in the future, virtual interviewing will become more and more popular. And then I will talk about the type of questions you might get in an interview, and I'll give some tips on how to handle these questions. So I guess this is a question I'm posing for you. So you, again, feel free to use the discussion box to submit your answers, but what sort of qualities do you think that an employer is looking for? We've got some comments coming in. I know some things that, when I think of is maybe someone who has the right technical skills to do the job. But is there anything else? Team fit. So how does this individual fit within the team environment? That's great. Well, surveys have been done and employers have said that the type of qualities that they're looking for is really that strong skill set. So this could be things like technical skills. So these are things that you're learning in your PhD or postdoc training. But there's also a number of transferable or soft skills that are really critical in various workplaces. Things like communication, leadership, analytical skills, that teamwork, interpersonal skills, being able to communicate effectively, work with others, and obviously problem solving. And your PhD definitely allows you to do that. They also, employers report that they're looking for certain personality traits. So this is integrity, adaptability, a really strong work ethic, motivation, and innovation. And yeah, some of you have really commented on these and hit the nail on the head. But really, when it comes down to it, an employer wants to know during the interview, do you have the technical skills to do the job? Does your personality really fit within the organization? That goes back to the fit comment that came in the chat box. Are you interested in doing the work? So is it that you're just looking for a job, or is it this job that really speaks to you? How long do you plan to stay? And this doesn't necessarily mean that when someone's looking to hire you that they think that you'll stay at the company for the rest of your life. But maybe there's a potential for you to move up in the organization. Many employers are looking for someone who can potentially move up into a more senior leadership role with time. And again, how do you work with other members of the team? So even if you have the skills, if you don't fit within the existing team that's already there, it's going to be a really hard sell to have you come on board and join the team. But if you've been asked for an interview, they've already seen from your resume that you likely have the technical skills. And more of the interview is really trying to figure out, are you the right fit for the role? And that's really what interviewing comes down to. I thought it would be helpful for us to kind of take a step back at this point and get an overview of the interview process. I was actually really unfamiliar with this when I was in my PhD training. Maybe I knew some of this, but I didn't realize all of the kind of nuances. So when you see a job posted online or on a job board, you are going to apply for that job. And you're going to be probably one of 100 plus applicants. In some fields, this might be less. In other fields, I know it's pretty common in biotech and pharma for a science role that there are often over 200 people who apply for a position. The first people who generally look at these applications are human resource specialists. So these are not, oftentimes it's not the hiring manager. And so really what they're doing is they're looking at the application material, the resume, as well as the cover letter, and they're trying to determine if the person fits the job based off the job description. They may have talked to the hiring manager, gotten some additional insight, but really they're using that job ad as an indicator. This is what they're looking for. Does this application match? So that's something really to keep in mind. And that human resource specialist or recruiter potentially might be a person who's filtering that large pool of applicants down to a smaller pool of individuals. So if that's the case, again, they're looking to see, can you do the job? And if they feel like you can, if you have the right technical skills, they might move you on to the next round where you're doing a phone interview. So the hiring manager or the human resource person might go forward and, the human resources then usually gives a smaller applicant pool to the hiring manager. So if you do get to the hiring manager, that's good. You got through the first round. At that point, that's when phone interviews happen, but they usually don't do a phone interview for every single person who kind of gets through HR. They might only select about 15 people for that phone interview. And so from that phone, and that's on the high end. And so if you get through the phone interview, then you might get to the next round of interviews, which historically this has been in person, but right now there's a lot of virtual interviewing happening. So for most roles, there's only a small group of people who are doing this kind of final round interviews. It's really hard to coordinate to get all of the people on the team to meet with someone. So again, we're only talking about 3 to 5 people. And really in the end, as you move through this process, it's more looking at your application material, determining, does your application material demonstrate that you have the right skills based off the job ad? And then it goes more to, do you have the right fit for the team, the organization, the role? And so this is just really important. I find that some individuals, when I've talked to them about their job search process, maybe they've applied for 50 plus jobs and never have gotten an actual phone interview. That might be an indicator that there's maybe their application material could be tweaked in such a way that they're getting past human resources. So just a little tidbit, although we're not talking about resumes today, but I did want to share that. So at the end, a final offer is made, and this whole process really narrows it down to one employee. So with all of this in mind, there is some just kind of general tips on things to do to prepare for an interview. So regardless of where you are in this process, whether it's a phone interview or your last round interview, I think it's really advantageous to spend some time researching ahead of time. So research the organization. If you can, research the team, the role. If this is later in the interview process, you might be able to know who you're meeting with. Hopefully you'll have an agenda with the name of the individuals. And if that's the case, do your research on those individuals. I think a great place to find information is go to the company website, look at their mission statement, their strategic visions. Is there any recent news articles? Maybe you'll want to go onto social media and see what they're putting out there. I think LinkedIn is particularly good to look at the background for the people that you're meeting with. So I received my PhD from UNC. Almost always when I interview, I know at least one person previously went to UNC, either for grad school or postdoc. My team here at Hopkins, many of us have connections to North Carolina. So, you'll find that kind of small world as you move forward, and those personal connections can really help as you move forward in the process. Another thing you might do, especially if you're transitioning from academia, either as a PhD or postdoc, is that often you're ready to hit the job market and you're applying for a number of positions at the same time. So in this process, you might forget the nuances from one job to the next. So I always encourage individuals to review their application material. You're going into an interview where this is the impression they kind of have of you, and they might ask you questions about your application material. So you want to have these things refreshed so you can recall them versus being like, not sure what they're talking about, but it was something that you clearly indicated in your cover letter or resume. I also think it's really helpful to anticipate questions and practice potential answers ahead of time. The goal is not to memorize answers, but to be comfortable. Interviewing really is a learned skill, so the more you practice, the better you'll be. And we'll go through this in more detail later in the talk. And then I also think it's helpful to prepare questions ahead of time. So I did notice some questions came into the chat box. I'm going to try my best to balance the presentation as well as these questions. Someone asked whether they think you're, how common is it for companies to give you feedback, even minimal? Like, you didn't get past this stage. Why are you left wondering? This is a really good point. So I have found that not all companies will let you know if you've made it past a stage. In some automated systems, it will just tell you like after a period of time that the position has been closed. And so therefore you're left to assume that someone else interviewed and got the position, and you won't necessarily know that you didn't make it through the first round. I think it is very appropriate that if you have at least if you've made it to the final round interview, they should let you know that you did not get the job, and they should be able to give you feedback. I think it's perfectly fine if you've interviewed with a role or for a role to ask, I was really excited about this position, and out of curiosity, was there anything that I could potentially do different to better present myself? Or, was there a particular reason that, that you didn't think I was an ideal fit? And you could do it in such a way where you're just really leading with curiosity and not being accusational or anything like that, that you could get feedback on what you can do to improve. And it's really about building a rapport with these individuals. It may be that they were looking for someone who had slightly more technical skills or brought a certain technique to the table that you didn't have. But if you end up building a good rapport with the people, they might be excited to bring you on for a different role down the road. I have definitely had that happen to me, where I've interviewed for a role. I actually got down to the final 2 applicants. It was a very long interview process. I think there was like 6 rounds total, more than normal. But at the end of the day, the offer was given to someone else, and they did have slightly more experience. But due to that interview process, I was actually invited to interview for another position at the university. And so actually my impression that I made didn't get me the position I initially applied for, but it allowed me to get another opportunity at the organization. So it's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so we're gonna move on. So there are different types of interviews. I mentioned this in the initial slide. So oftentimes we find ourselves, starting off with that first round interview, that phone interview. Then we will typically move on to a virtual interview in some cases, especially if you are not a local candidate, and then that final round interview will be in person. In many industries right now, in-person interviews have been suspended. And so oftentimes individuals are having multiple rounds of virtual interviews. And looking into, stats that have been published by, people within the, HR world, companies have been conducting virtual interviews. About 50% of companies were engaging in some aspect of virtual interview throughout their process prior to COVID. And it's very likely that the virtual interview will be an aspect of the interview process moving forward. Although I do suspect that final rounds will go back to in-person in many cases. So phone interviews. A couple of things I wanted to share about this. So there could be multiple rounds of phone interviews, but again, usually this is the kind of initial screen to say, verifying things on your resume, trying to get to know, should we move forward with this candidate or not? And it's great to have a phone interview because, again, if phone interview is kind of that first round cut, It could be done by an HR professional. This is pretty common. Again, this is someone who is not intimately involved in the position that they're hiring for. They have a job description. They may have had a short conversation. They are very familiar with the organization and the kind of goals of the organization. But they, again, are just doing the initial screen. Sometimes you might be working with a third-party recruiter. If you haven't had an opportunity to do this, a recruiter, the nature of what they're doing is if they don't think you're the right fit for this role, they may actually suggest other roles for you to apply for. So I know trainees, if they've found themselves in this position, they often think it's strange, but that is what the role of a recruiter is. Just know that these phone interviews are typically quite short. So oftentimes they'll say 15 to 30 minutes. I like to schedule at least a lot on my calendar, at least 30 minutes for these sort of interviews, just in case the conversation is going well and extends a little bit longer. I ensure that they're in a quiet place. So I have a young son, a 17-month-old. So if I knew I had a phone interview, I would do my best to have the nanny or my husband take him for a walk so he's outside of the house, because I can't really control when he screams and not. I do my I do my homework ahead of time. So I realize that early in this process, you might get more common interview questions, and I'll give a few examples of what that looks like, but I kind of practice these going into it. I also look into salary expectations. I always tell people I don't like to talk about salary until I have a job offer, because I have no power to negotiate until I'm the final candidate. But sometimes, especially with recruiters, they may ask your salary expectation very early on in the process, and you don't want to be blindsided by this. And so really the salary expectations at this point, they're really just trying to determine whether what they have in mind and what you're looking for is in somewhat alignment. If they can only afford, let's just say, $80,000 and you're looking for 120, it would be very hard for them to go forward with you in a candidate and invest that time and energy knowing that they won't be able to do that. So if you do have, what I like to do ahead of time is, while I try not to talk about salary expectations, if it does come up in conversation, I do like to be prepared. I usually say something vague like, it is hard for me to say what a fair salary would be for this role without knowing more about the role. If they push, then I say, well, based off of my research, what I know in the job description and what I found from, based off of my level of training, I think a fair range would be from this to this. So I give a range between $5,000 to $10,000. And that really is based off of the information I get, either online through places like salary.com, Glassdoor, where I'm looking at maybe the specific company, the specific role in the geographic region, or something comparable. And depending on where you're looking, if you're going to, let's just say, a public university, information's online where you can actually get salary from, look at what other members of the team are. Another thing I highly recommend is if you can do some informational interviews with either alumni from your university or any sort of, if you can build contacts at a company or within an industry, you can ask, previously, what is a fair range for someone entering this field with this level of expertise, or straight out from grad school or straight out from postdoc, and they can give you some insight. And so if you can actually give information about having conversations with people in the field versus just doing a Google search, I think that's actually much more impactful. I also think it's important to show enthusiasm when you're interviewing, and it's really hard in a phone interview. They can't see your facial expression. So it's actually been shown that if you smile while you talk, that this can actually change the inflection of your voice. So it might sound strange, but you may actually want to smile throughout your conversation, so you're projecting enthusiasm. Also, if you're sitting for long periods of time, you actually begin to sit on your diaphragm. So it might be helpful to stand up and just gently walk around. I'm not talking about pacing your entire house, but maybe, walking a little bit throughout the conversation will help keep your energy up. And at the end of the conversation, you definitely want to have some questions prepared, and you want to have your questions relevant to whoever you're speaking with. So if you are speaking to a recruiter or an HR professional, they're not going to know a lot of details about the nature of the work. So you want to make sure that the questions you ask make sense for them. So if you are working with a hiring manager, you could probably say something like, what do you view the most challenging aspect of the job? Or what sort of qualities are you looking for in a candidate? But if you're maybe talking to someone who isn't the hiring manager, then you can ask questions like, who is this position reporting to? Or what is the timeline for hiring for this role? Any sort of thing that can help you gain some more information about the position, but also give you insight into what the future might look like. There has been a couple of questions in the chat box, but it looks like one question has been upticked. In the first interview, should we tell them if they ask about immigration status, and how should we handle it? So yeah, this is a really good question. If they don't ask about it, I don't bring it up. It's kind of very similar to salary, that you really want them to invest in you. If you can make it to the final round and they have selected you as the top candidate, then they're probably very excited to go forward and do those sort of things. And it really also depends what type of company. I think you can do some research online ahead of time to see how many or if this company has done visa sponsorship or anything like that previously. If so, it's probably something they're very comfortable with. For other organizations, it might be out of their wheelhouse, something that they haven't done. So I do think that for international students, it's something that if the conversation does come up, I think that you need to be well informed in what the process would look like. And so that way, if the other person you're speaking to is just unfamiliar with, OPT, CPT, visa sponsorship and all of that sort of things, that you can guide the conversation with confidence that on what that might look like. I hope that's helpful. I know for us, we definitely partner with our Office of International Services, OIS, and then they provide a lot of support to trainees on how to communicate effectively with employers on what that looks like. Someone asked, what is the biggest mistake someone can do during a phone interview? You know what? That's a good question. I don't know if this is necessarily the biggest mistake, but I will say that this is a mistake that could happen, that if someone email or calls you out of the blue and asks to do a phone interview, like, oh, hi, CJ, are you ready? I'm calling from such and such organization. I would love to talk to you about this role. Do you have a moment? If I am busy, if I'm doing, if I was in lab setting up an experiment or, let's just say, watching my son, I wouldn't be in the best place to be able to focus on the phone interview. And so instead of saying yes, because I'm so kind of taken back and excited that they've called me about the role, I would instead express enthusiasm and say, oh, thank you so much for calling. I'm really excited about this position and I'm happy to talk about it. Unfortunately, right now it's not a great time. Is there any way we can reschedule to a later date, either a later time today or tomorrow? And that way, when the interview is set, I'm coming into the conversation prepared. So that's definitely something to consider. Someone had also asked, I found myself totally different from day to day compared to how I am doing an interview. Do you have any strategies to not get too nervous? Again, I think I mentioned this earlier. I think interviewing is a practice skill. The more you do it, the better you'll get. And so I know for our office at the PDCO, we offer the opportunity for trainees to meet with us for mock interviews. And so I would really suggest for you to look into what sort of opportunities exist at your own institute or your own school. Many career service career service offices do that. So this is a great place to do an interview in a safe space. If for whatever reason this service doesn't exist, see if one of your friends, your colleagues would be able to do a mock interview with you. I think this is a great thing. I mean, now that we're all on Zoom or whatever the virtual platform is that you use, it's really easy to do this. I just worked with a trainee who was interviewing for PA school, and he actually set up a Zoom panel with friends and colleagues that were in medical school and nursing school to help him with his PA interview, in addition to working with our office. So great way to kind of gain experience. And again, the more you do this, I think the more comfortable you'll be. So I want to also talk about virtual interviewing a little bit more in depth. As I said, it was something that was regularly done prior to COVID, but it is now the standard. Things that you can do to really help, set yourself up for success when it comes to a virtual interview is definitely test your technology. So this morning, I was having all kinds of issues with my computer because the university did an update on Outlook. And so in my first meeting, I kept on having this Outlook password thing pop up over and over again. Granted, I was conducting a mock interview versus actually being interviewed. But had that happened in my actual interview, I would have had a lot of distractions. So you definitely want to, one, make sure that your technology works, that the platform you're working on works. You start your computer early. Definitely don't wait to the last minute. I would also encourage you to close all non-essential processes. Again, you want to avoid those sort of pop-ups or distractions. You also want to make sure that it doesn't slow your internet connection. Do your best to limit distractions. As I said, we're all kind of working from home to some aspect. So, we have family members, we have pets, all of these things. I mean, I think everyone realizes that's the case, but do your best to limit these distractions. Again, if you can have a roommate, a spouse, a neighbor, maybe walk your dog. As I said, my son, he's napping in the room next door. Things you can do to try to avoid those sort of distractions help. I also think it's good to set the scene. For me personally, and I have talked to a couple of recruiters as well as hiring managers, people actually like to see your background. I know some people prefer to use a virtual background, but I personally find them distracting, especially sometimes it can cut your hair in and out, which can look strange. So instead, if you can, make your background look professional. So I'm in our spare bedroom of our house. There's only so much I can do with my setup. But one, I have made sure that it is clean in the background. There isn't a major mess. Again, you don't need to be behind a bookshelf and look like you're in an office per se. But again, you don't want clothes everywhere or, things, again, that can be distracting. And another thing is that there are going to be glitches that happen. So if possible, be prepared to email the person either prior to the event and say, I'm really excited for this meeting. I already tested the technology, but in case there's any issues, here's my cell phone number. Feel free to call me if there's any issues on the day of the event. So that way, if your technology does drop out, you're not panicking, that you have some kind of contingency plan. Another thing to consider is I really feel like it's important to dress the part. So if you're going to dress the same way that you would be for an in-person. So if you would normally wear a suit to your in-person event, do the same thing on Zoom. If you would normally wear a dress shirt and a tie to an interview, do the same thing in the virtual interview. I don't think that being in the virtual interview is a reason to kind of slack. I think it's also important, I think more so in a virtual interview than in person. I mean, be careful of this in both settings, but I think that there's additional nuances when you're in the virtual interview. to be really mindful of your body language. I feel like you're in your home, you're not in the same sort of setting, that you kind of, it's very easy to fall back into more casual tendencies. I know for me, I have a tendency to use my hands, and this can be very distracting. And so I think, again, going back to doing a mock interview, either with your career service office or maybe a colleague, and see, is there these sort of body language things that you do that might be distracting? I've worked with many trainees that have swivel chairs, and they don't realize it, but they'll actually swivel the entire time we're having a conversation. Again, these are just natural things that may come up. Just figure out what it is that you might be doing and try to either, compensate or change the situation, such as potentially switching to a flat back chair during the talk to avoid that from arising. I also find that depending on your technology, for many of us, when we give a presentation, we end up or are doing a virtual call, we'll look at the camera. For some of us, it actually will look like we're not making eye contact. Again, if you do the mock interview on the virtual platform ahead of time, you'll know if that's the case, because you really want to appear to be making eye contact the entire time. And this is something that you would do during a virtual interview. And again, I think it is more important to seem relaxed and engaged than like really focusing on the camera. So just trying to find that balancing act, I think, is important. But if you find yourself looking up and away, that can be incredibly distracting. In some industries, you might be asked to show your work. So I know for data scientists, it might be that they have to show some coding that they've done. So utilize things like share screen, have things up on your desktop that you might end up showing, things like that, if you know that this is important to or commonplace in your industry. And again, come in with thoughtful questions. If this is getting closer to your final round interview, you might ask questions about like, what will the day-to-day work be like? What is considered success for this role? What are you hoping the person hired would be able to accomplish within the first 3 months? How is feedback given for the role? Again, things that will allow you to get a better insight on what your position might be if you were to be offered this role. So we had some questions that came in. Someone asked about the tell me about yourself. We'll go through that. Another person said, for phone interviews, is it okay to ask follow-up questions immediately answering the questions, or should we wait until all the questions are asked? I think you can balance this. So if someone asks a question and you don't understand what the question is, it's definitely good to ask clarifying questions. You don't want to go on a tangent on something which is actually not related to what the individual question is. So clarifying questions, I think, is really good. But if someone asks something and you answer, but you have questions based off of that question, it might be good to wait towards the end. I think, again, it's a balancing thing. It's perfectly fine for this. I mean, I think good interviews are actually conversations, but you also want to make sure that the person that you don't feel like you're coming back constantly, like, well, can you tell me more? Can you tell me more? Can you tell me more? So just trying to find a good balance, I think, is good. So someone asked, do you have any advice for dealing with interviews where you're only asked a set of questions? You can only ask a set of questions set out by the company or organization and not allowed to ask follow-ups. I find it's difficult to keep these as conversational. So I'm actually not familiar with this happening. It may be very industry specific. Unfortunately, I think it's all of my interviewing has been, I've been able to ask any sort of follow-up questions at the end. So unfortunately, I'm not quite sure. Morgan, if you could tell me more about what industry you're in, maybe I can look into that. Yes, someone asked about about hand gestures, and they've also talked about keyboard sounds being very distracting. That is one of my issues, is that I record a lot of talks I give, and I realize that my mouse is quite noisy. And so I've tried to come up with different ways to not have a distracting mouse and to use my keyboard so it's not quite as loud. What is some things, obviously someone wrote, you can't control everything, so you might have some outside noise. Well, this actually reminds me of a time I was doing a phone interview. At the time I lived in an apartment. I had all the windows open because it was a beautiful day in the spring. And about 5 minutes before the interview, our landscaping team came and all of a sudden was, mowing the grass. And I was in a panic. I ran around the house and shut all the windows, and it really muffled the sound. So what I always tell people is just shut your windows preemptively, because you don't know what's going to happen in the middle of the interview. And if it's a phone interview, try to find a quiet place away from windows that might be distracting. If it's a virtual interview where you are more worried about setting the scene, if something comes up, just stay professional and say, I apologize. I didn't realize that my neighbor was going to be mowing their grass today. And people realize that this does come up, especially now that we have more limited ability to go to different places for interviews. So as I said earlier, previously, in-person interviews were the final round of interviews, but again, many of these are being done virtually. If you do an in-person or a final round interview virtually, these are going to typically be longer interviews. They can last anywhere from a half day to a full day. Depending on your industry, it could be a combination of one-on-one meetings. It could be a panel interview. If it's in person, there's usually, because they're longer, there's usually a eating component, whether that's lunch or dinner. Depending on your field, you might be asked to give a presentation. And in some cases, there may be some case questions or some case studies that you have to do. And so again, I think getting an agenda ahead of time will give you a better understanding of what the expectations are. And again, I think there are a lot of resources out there. So if anyone on the call is interested in, let's just say, consulting, or I think in certain data science world, there's actually technical questions that you have to do, where you have to do a code where they send you a case in advance, and then you have to work on it. I know for consulting, there's a lot of case questions. Again, understanding what's the norm in your field and being able to prepare for that ahead of time, I think really is going to help you be successful. And again, if you are sent the agenda and have any questions, definitely follow up to the person who sent you the agenda. Ask for clarification. I think the more you know what the expectations are going into it, the better you'll interview. A few last tips is, one, take notes. I have seen people take notes during an interview. My personal preference is to wait until the interview's over. I try to stay completely engaged in the moment, but what I do is immediately after the interview, then I write down notes. That's my personal preference. So immediately after the phone interview, I'll jot down a few things that were shared, any of the answers I had to the question. Again, if you're doing a lot of interviews, you might forget things that came up. Also, for final round interviews, I try to remember tidbits about the people I talk with. So I might say, Sally was talked about homeschooling her daughter. And so in my thank you emails, I tried to email every single person I spoke with. So if it's a final round interview and I've met with 10 people that day, I send 10 thank you emails within 24 hours. I express my interest in the position. I thank them for their time. And then I try to give a personal tidbit about the conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you about your work. It seems like the, team-based approach has led to some really innovative progress within your division. I would love to be able to join the team. Or, I best of luck with homeschooling. Hopefully, your daughter will be able to start hybrid classes soon. Things like that help you stand out and, again, give that personal touch. These thank you emails do not need to be incredibly long, but again, I think it's really important to do them professionally, and and I do think that 24 hours is appropriate. talking to one of my alumni who is now a hiring manager, she said that she actually will not move forward with any candidate if she does not receive a thank you. And I know some people ask about mailing thank you letters versus emails. Right now, that's probably not the best to do mailing, just because you're not going to know someone's home address. But if we do return to in-person interviews, if you'd like to do it, it's fine. It's a nice personal touch, but I do think that you still need to do a thank you email to get it to the person, because you don't know when they'll be making their decision on hiring, and you don't want it to be after before your letter gets there. And in general, I think it's important to remember that you're being interviewed because your documents have already demonstrated that you have something that they're interested in. You've already made it through that first round. So be confident in yourself and what you bring to the table. So that's just some general tips. I thought this would be a good time to transition into the types of questions that the type of questions you might get in an interview. So there are kind of three buckets of questions. So one is technical. This is really about your skill set. So for scientists, this will be about your research, what you bring to the table, what you've done in the past. Whatever, nursing, it may be about the classes you took, your experience working in a hospital, things like that. And so it's really, again, it's the technical aspect that's kind of described in the job ad. We're not going to go through that today because honestly, for most of the trainees I work with, this is the part of the interview that they're most comfortable with because they know their research, they know like what skills that they bring for the job. It's the other two buckets, the common interview questions and these behavioral interview questions that they kind of trip up a little bit more on. And I feel like this is things that you should definitely practice ahead of time. So what are common interview questions? I've put a lot of them here. I'm sure many of you recognize these, but a colleague of mine actually framed this that each of these common interview questions, that there's a real question behind the question. So for tell me about yourself, this is a really short bio to get the conversation started. And we'll go through this in a little bit more. I feel like if you are going to really practice, like you should practice interviewing in general, but this tell me about yourself is usually the first question you get to an interview. Again, it's going to start the conversation, but I think for many trainees, this is where if they're not prepared, they end up rambling. And so definitely work on this. It was something that I used to do in the shower when I was, driving to work every day, things like that. What are your strengths and weaknesses? One way to rephrase this is, are you self-aware? Do you understand what you really bring to the table? Do you understand things that as your weakness, these are things that maybe take a little bit more effort? So what is it that you're self-aware? Like, what is your weakness? Are you aware of it? And what do you do to try to mitigate that? So what is your greatest accomplishment and why? This is a good indicator of what you value. What would a former colleague say about you? This is more of an indicator of your personality type. What do you know about your organization or this organization? Have you done your research? I have literally interviewed someone when I asked about the division. They couldn't even tell us the basic information on our website. And so even though on paper, I felt like this person had the technical skills, it made me feel like they weren't invested into the role because they hadn't done the basic research. And where do you see yourself in 5 years? This is how committed are you? And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be committed to this exact position or the specific organization. It could be how committed you are to the field. So oftentimes I'll tell individuals, instead of saying like, I want to have a director level position at your organization, which could be potentially the person you're interviewing, and you're basically saying, I want your job. You can say, well, it's hard to say exactly where I'll be in 5 years, but I suspect, but what I do know is that I am really interested in doing X, Y, Z, and therefore I see myself continuing in this field and blah, blah, blah. So that way, again, you're just showing commitment to the work versus, saying this is my role will be. I did think that a nice This is usually what I would do in exercise, but since this is in a virtual space, I'll just kind of guide you through this. For the tell me about yourself, the technique I like to use, and this is not the only way that you can do this, but my personal preference is I like to start with the present. So I talk about my current position and I highlight, a recent accomplishment that's relevant to the position. Then I work back and say a little bit about my past experiences that are really relevant to what I am applying for. And then I like to finish out the conversation or the answer with a transition as to why I'm interested in this opportunity, how it's a really great fit for me, or how I'm a really great fit for the organization based off these past experiences. So if I use this framework, it allows me to quickly give a highlight of where I am at now, what I've done in the past, and how that's led me to where I am today. And so again, it doesn't necessarily have to fit in this particular format, but I do think that this is a good one to test out and see if it works for you. But again, I think it really helps give some structure so we're not providing too much information and potentially answering questions that might end up coming later on in the conversation. I did also want to talk about behavioral interview questions. Again, I feel like this is the type of questions that we see quite a bit, especially towards final round interviews. These behavioral interview questions are essentially questions that allow an employer to evaluate your past experiences and behaviors. And it's the theory that what you have done in the past, your past performance, is really the best indicator for what you'll do in the future. So again, they'll ask about things that you've done in the past, and it's really easy to spot these sort of questions because they have very similar phrases in the beginning. Tell me about a time when you describe the situation when you face this sort of problem. Tell me how you approach the situation. Think about a time. So again, it's really wanting to know about your past experiences and asking for definitive answers versus hypothetical ones on how would you handle this in the future? And I think a great technique to answer a behavioral interview question is the STAR technique. And so if you've seen this before, you've probably seen it with one R, but an alumni of the School of Public Health at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, who is also a hiring manager, told me that she loves this second R. And I'll tell you just a little bit about it. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. And again, we have that new second R, reflection. And that R comes into play in certain questions. So situation, tell me about a time. You start off by painting the scene. You're telling a story. Let them know when the situation happened. Was it when you were in grad school? Was it in postdoc? Was it during some student group you were involved in? Give enough information that they understand where the story is taking place. Then you want to clearly state the goal you were working towards. So what is it that you were trying to achieve? Give some very explicit actions you took. Even if the question was about a team-based activity, what is it that you did? Then you want to wrap up the answer with the result. So what was the outcome? What was the accomplishment? And if you can use this structure, it really can paint a very nice picture. And if you have a question where maybe there is what is a time that you failed to prioritize? Tell me a time that you made a mistake and did something wrong. So again, the answer is kind of negative. So when is it that you didn't do something correctly? This is where you can throw in that second R and really highlight what you've learned from the situation or what you now do differently because of, again, what you've learned, or what would you do differently looking back at it. So then you always end on that positive note. So I thought it would be helpful to just go through 2 examples of what this might look like. Again, you can work through this with your own experience. But the question I have here is describe a long-term project that you managed and how you were able to keep everything moving along in a timely manner. So this is really focusing on project management skills. So when I was a research assistant at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, I oversaw a very large research project that had numerous and international collaborators. If this project was related to the job I was applying for, I might give some additional details. One of my primary roles, in addition to doing a large aspect of the research, was also to ensure that we had these kind of various deadlines met. So each of our collaborators was kind of hitting their individual goals. So to ensure that we were moving forward and on task, I ended up organizing these regular virtual meetings. And so each of these meetings, I set very explicit agendas. I sent reminders to everyone. While we were in the meeting, we had an opportunity to really talk about progress. If anyone had any challenges, we were able to brainstorm as a team tips to overcome those challenges. We discussed anything coming up down the pipeline. So if we needed to make accommodations, order any sort of material, prepare documents, we were prepared for those sort of next steps. And we were able to discuss any sort of upcoming deadlines that were approaching. This format of meeting regularly and having everyone on the same page, it really lent itself to an effective collaboration. And we were able to finish the project slightly ahead of schedule. Currently, I'm working on the manuscript. So we've gone through a few rounds of revisions within the team. And I think we're at a point that I'm going to be able to submit this for publication next month. And so overall, it was a really successful collaboration. So again, you can use this STAR situation to give a really great answer. And again, people are thinking, oh my goodness, like they've been able to manage this like really diverse team with people in all different settings. Like I bet they could do that here at our organization. So another example I wanted to share was about a time that maybe wasn't a positive situation. So when is it that you failed to prioritize effectively? So when I was, during my most recent postdoc, recently during my postdoc here at Johns Hopkins University, I had an opportunity to teach a course for my PI. It was something I was really excited about and eager to take on. We also had a new student join the lab around the same time. Based off the student's interest, it made sense that I would be their primary mentor since there was a lot of alignment between my project and what they'd like to accomplish. What I found is with developing this new course or with teaching this new course, as well as mentoring a brand new student in the lab, I was really focusing on those responsibilities. And as a result, I found that I wasn't making much progress on my own research. But once I realized that this was the case, I became a little bit more intentional with my time. And I tried a technique called blocking, where on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I would really focus on my teaching responsibilities, designing my lectures, giving my lectures, doing open office hours, as well as grading. And that really allowed Monday, Wednesday, Thursday to be really focused on in the lab. And because I had spent a lot of time mentoring in the beginning, I did have the opportunity to delegate some responsibilities as well as some preliminary experiments to the new graduate student. And that really helped me start to make more progress on my research. Through this experience, I really did learn the importance of time management and being very intentional with my time. And it's something that I try to do moving forward. So again, you're talking about some time that you didn't do something well, but then you're really reflecting on what you've learned and how you respond differently. So how is it that you prepare for these sort of interviews, of these behavioral interview questions? Well, the first thing that you're going to do is just review the job ad. It's going to tell you what is key. So look at those soft skills: leadership, communication, teamwork, problem solving. Is there anything about deadlines or, reports that have to be made? And most likely you're going to have to ask are going to be asked behavioral interview questions about those skills. So then brainstorm your past experiences, look at your resume, your cover letter, think about when it is that you were working on a collaborative project. When is it that you had to take a leadership role? When did you work with someone who maybe disagreed with your viewpoint? And then from there, develop potential answers. I think it's really important to practice these. The goal is not to memorize. It's to be able to recall with confidence a scenario so you can talk about it more effectively in an interview. So just my final remarks today. A perfect interview does not exist. We are often our own worst critics, and so we will think that things went wrong in an interview, but the other person does not realize it. And I did say this before, interviewing is a learned skill. So the more you do, the better you'll get. So with that, I want to thank everyone and take some of the questions that have come into the chat box. So someone asked that if an applicant has not heard from the group they applied for after 1 or even 2 weeks, should the applicant attempt to email the group with a follow-up interview or informational interview question? So I think that this is a good question. So if you applied, like if you actually have someone's email, so like if you applied by emailing someone and you haven't heard back, I think it's perfectly fine to reach out and say, you know, I'm really interested in this position. And then you can follow up with some tidbit. I would be careful and be very, I would be careful not to ask too many times. It may be that the process is going slower. I think it's actually much more common to follow up after you've interviewed versus just applying. So I know that one tip that I've done is if I was applying, for example, Hopkins has you apply through an online portal. So it goes to the HR professional. And so whether my resume goes to the hiring manager or not has to do with the HR professional. But I could tell from the job description who the director of the office was. And so I, in addition to applying online, emailed the director personally, and I said, you know, dear so-and-so, I saw the position posted online. I've already submitted my application online. I'm really excited about potentially interviewing. I've attached my CV and resume in case you wanted to review. And that way I've already connected with the hiring manager. It's kind of up to them whether they want to reach out, but it also prevents the HR manager from not pushing your application forward, even if the hiring manager thinks you are potentially a good fit. So should you only send thank you emails after the last round of interviews? No, you should send thank you emails at every aspect. Phone interview, virtual interview, so on and so forth. And especially for for in-person interviews, be kind to everyone. Like that's actually how, like I was giving a presentation for a job, and you know, I was coming in at the same time a number of other people were coming in to view my presentation. I ended up holding the door open for everyone and was, you know, smiling and saying hello and introducing myself. And actually one of those people was a director for a different office. And again, although I didn't get the job I initially applied for, I made such a good impression through my presentation. And they said that the fact that I was so friendly, that they really wanted to extend the invite for me to interview for a job that wasn't even posted yet. Someone else asked, what was the most memorable interview you ever have conducted? What are things that interviewees did or said that stand out favorably in your eyes? Well, I actually will say the opposite. One time I interviewed someone who did something that I thought was unfavorable, which is that they wore purple tights, which I know that sounds crazy, but it was very distracting. And after the interview, everyone was talking about what the person wore versus how they interviewed. And again, I felt like they had the qualifications, but again, their clothing was quite distracting. I think the ones that stand out to me are people who have done their research and are excited about the role. So, I think that really that fit and that enthusiasm for me is really important. Another question was, there is more specific to negotiations during the final stage of the interview process. One, how should you bring up the question, would you be open to working remotely for this job? If you don't want to move to another state, and the job can be done remotely. I mean, once, I guess I'm not quite sure if this is during the negotiation process or during the final rounds of interview. If you get to, I feel like it's perfectly fine if you know you're not going to relocate to another job, then maybe that would be something that you might want to bring up final round interview. I have excused myself from a job where I had a lot of personal contacts at this particular company. It was a biotech company. And as the interview proceeded, I realized the job was just a little bit different than it was initially described in the job description. I thought that the position would be like, based in the Maryland area, but it was actually something that was going to cover up to New York. And because I had a lot of friends in the company, once I knew that I was not going to accept the position, I actually excused myself from the role and from consideration, because I just felt like I didn't want to leave a negative impression on the company and potentially impact my friends who worked there. So that's just also something, is that depending on if you have personal connections, you really want to be mindful. The people I interviewed for were incredibly respectful. They thought I made a great impression, and I've actually stayed in contact with them. And although I'm not looking to do those sort of roles, I just know that if I ever wanted to move into that sort of industry or that sort of role, that I've kind of maintained those relationships. Someone asked about virtual backgrounds should not be used. That's my personal preference. I think someone commented on that, so that's good. Yeah, the comment is, what are you trying to cover up? I'm trying to scroll through and see if there's any questions I potentially missed. If I missed your question, I do apologize. But it looks like I may have gotten all of them. Oh, someone posted a new question. Starting from the review date stated on the job post, typically what is the time delay between being informed of the initial interview? Same question for the final interview. I wish that there was a one-size-fit-all answer for this. This just really, really depends. So I think a lot of it has to do with knowing your industry. So if any of you are interested in federal jobs, specifically applying for usajobs.gov, that process could be very cumbersome. And so this is one of those things that, again, from the time you apply to the time an interview could happen could be 3+ months. Sometimes, for whatever reason, they have to close a job and repost because for whatever reason, the applicants can't even get through HR. This is one of those things where the hiring managers will not even see any applications and unless they fit the criteria that that the job description has. And so therefore you really have to learn how to write a federal resume. The good thing is there are tools online that can help you with this. I think one great tool is gogovernment.org. So if you are looking to apply for usajobs.gov, just know that. I know that for some companies, it will give you updates whether they've moved to the interview process. Some of these companies move really quickly. I do think, again, it really depends on your industry. So I know for startup companies, they move quite fast. Usually when they post a job, they needed someone yesterday, whereas larger companies, it could be much slower. So for most people, I would say the most common is from the time that if you were the final applicant, from the time you applied to the time you get hired is 3 months. But I've actually interviewed for a job where from the time I applied to the time I made it to the final round, which I wasn't even the person selected, that was almost a 6-month process. So do companies wait till the final deadline to review the applications, or do they see them as soon as they come in? So rolling versus this again depends on companies, but I often find that many companies will start to review applications as soon as they come in. And so maybe especially HR professionals may say, like, I know this happens at Hopkins, that they'll say, if we can get 5 what we think are good candidates to the hiring manager, that's what we think success is. So as soon as they've hit however many they think are a good candidate and pass them on, they'll start focusing on other jobs. So again, if you can potentially circumvent HR, especially at an academic setting, I would encourage you to do so. And another thing that actually I think really helps get you past the HR part is if you have any sort of personal connections. So again, I think networking, we didn't talk about this today. Networking is a huge part of successfully interviewing. And so one of the things is, moving forward in your job ad, or the job search process. So in addition to applying for jobs online, I always encourage my trainees to spend some time doing informational interviews. If you have a target company, try to reach out to any alumni of your organization, someone that you can have a mutual connection. It's easy because they were in your shoes just a few years prior. Ask for an opportunity to meet with them on Zoom or whatever platform for 30 minutes, get to know them a little bit more, ask about their interview process, what it's like to work at the company. Then when you go to apply, you can say, it was really great talking to you. I loved learning about the organization. I'm actually going to go ahead and apply for this role. Would it be okay if I mentioned your name in the cover letter? And if they say yes, that's great. You are almost always guaranteed a phone interview at that process or at that point. Or they may be comfortable enough to recommend you as an internal referral if that exists in their organization. I've done a lot of informational interviews myself, and I've actually been invited to interview for a role that wasn't posted yet based off of these informational interviews. So I think that they can be quite impactful. So another question came in. Please tell us about negotiation of salary after a successful final interview. Again, I think one thing I will say is that negotiation is much more than just salary. So think about the entire package, knowing what's on the table. So depending on your industry, you might have stock options, you might have bonuses, relocation fees, things like that. So salary is a part of it. And so I would really look into the entire package, figure out what your 3 musts are, what are 3 things that are maybes, and then we don't have time to go through this, but I always try to schedule a meeting to meet virtually to have a conversation versus go through it via email. Because I feel like you want it to be really a conversation. They've invested a lot of time on you as the final candidate, but you also want to make sure that you realize that some things maybe aren't negotiable. So they may say, like, we can't go above this particular pay grade. Like, this is what we pay for the role. However, we're able to do a sign-on bonus and pay for relocation. And then you can ask, like, well, how likely would it be able to be promoted from this role, after 2 years' time or something like that, where then you can learn more about it. I know that for some companies, there is just a specific pay grade, and for equity reasons, everyone who has a specific role falls within that range, and level of experience kind of puts them in the range. And so, yes, definitely try to negotiate, but also realize that many companies are trying to do the best that they can and give you a competitive offer because they really do want you to stay. So we had a lot more questions coming in. So what questions did you ask at the end of the interview what questions should you ask at the end of your interview when it's the hiring manager? So you have a hiring manager. So this is where you can ask questions more about the day-to-day. So like, what does the day-to-day responsibilities look like? You might ask, why is this role open? It will let you know whether it's a new position or if someone potentially left the role. Maybe they were promoted, and that seems really good. That seems like they value people at this organization. You can ask the hiring manager, what is it that you enjoy most about this team? Maybe what are some challenges that you see the person coming into this role? What are, so any sort of questions that you think a hiring manager might be able to give insight, things that you're really curious about that can give you more of an information about whether this is something that you're interested in. I did not say this, but an interview is a two-way street. As much as they're determining whether they want you as a candidate, you are also evaluating this offer and saying, do I want to work at this organization? So again, you're looking at these, you can use these questions to get better insight to see, do you actually want to be at this particular company? So someone asked about academic jobs. These are more on a cycle process accepting positions. Yes, that's very true. So there is a typical cycle for academic jobs. This doesn't mean that jobs exist outside of the academic cycle. And I should say that this is specifically for faculty positions. Postdocs pop up all the time. Research positions pop up all the time. I know that sometimes a lot of positions in academia that are like support roles, staff positions, things like administrative roles, which I'm in, may come out based off of like fiscal year. So they had a new position budgeted. And so starting July 1, positions won't be posted. Or they might have already approval before this, but they're waiting until the academic year and graduating students and post a job in May. So I noticed when I was on the job search and I was really looking for jobs in academia, I did not see anything in November and December. And then all of a sudden, January, there was a big flood of positions. So again, knowing what exists for your industry, I think is very helpful. Well, I think that might be the last of the questions that I saw. If there is anything else, I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes to answer additional questions. Again, if you want to pop off and go to another session, feel free. Feel free to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'll be honest, I'm not on Twitter quite as much as I should be. But I'm on LinkedIn quite frequently. This was a great discussion. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for putting so many questions in the chat box. This has been really helpful, allowing me to better understand what your interests are. Thank you everyone again for coming. And yes, the session is recorded, so you'll be able to view, especially if you're not hitting the job market for a while and it's information that you want to go through. I, again, didn't go into great detail about negotiating or the application process, but there's a ton of great resources. If you are a Hopkins trainee, just know that we cover these sort of topics. Again, you can always meet with myself or one of my colleagues one-on-one, or if you're in a different school, every one of our schools has a career or professional development support team, a life design team that can help you with mock interviews, CV reviews, negotiation, things like that. And then depending on your field, you might find some great resources out there. I obviously have a biotech background. One of my favorite places is iBiology. They have a nice 4-part series on breaking into industry. So it goes through the entire process of searching for jobs, applying, interviewing, and salary negotiation. But I'm sure things like this exist for whatever field you're in. And again, this is where your career service team, wherever you're at, can help you kind of navigate and point you in the right direction of resources. Well, it looks like no more questions are coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and end the session. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you so much for coming to today's session. For those of you who are not Hopkins trainees, feel free to connect on LinkedIn. I mean, everyone can. For those of you who are at Hopkins, I hope I have the opportunity to meet you in person at some point moving forward. So everyone have a fantastic day.